cosas entendí. No diré lo que sentí, porque hay cosas que no pasan hablando, sino que la voz trascienden cantando. Canto sin cantar por mí. Y noche tan oscura veo que careo, porque no careo.
Jeszcze do Hiszpanii, tak? Do Hiszpanii po angielsku. Nie. Oddaję głos Piotrowi Sobolczykowi.
So, we're switching the language now because my presentation is in English, although it deals with the Spanish translation, which we can see here, Diario de levantamiento de Varsovia. So I will be speaking about different aspects of this publication. Perhaps you want to see it? Has anyone not seen it? Okay. Beata, did you pass it to the others? Okay. So I won't probably read the whole text, but I must enlarge it. That's right. So okay. But I will begin so that you know who the translator is and the publishing house. So my presentation is called A Memoir That in Spain Became a Diary, because actually the title is Diario, not Memorias. In 2011, the prestigious Spanish publishing house Alba Editorial from Barcelona published a translation of Miron Białoszewski's Chaux d'Œuvre. Just to give some example, Alba is the Spanish publisher of John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Bertolt Brecht, Daphne du Maurier, André Gide, D.H. Lawrence, Joyce Carol Oates, Sylvia Plath, Tennessee Williams, Stefan Zweig, which is a list that instantly shows you that they have a kind of understanding for queer modernists. Not to mention Spanish contemporary writers and classics, and the world literature classics, that is for instance the Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, etc., etc. As for Polish names, Alba is also the publisher of Tadeusz Kantor, translated also by Katarzyna Olszewska-Sonnenberg. She translated also Miron Białoszewski and has an impressive list of achievements, which includes the name of Czesław Miłosz, Zofia Naukowska, Jerzy Andrzejewski, Tadeusz Borowski, Włodzimierz Odojewski, and more. The translation and publication of the book was supported by the Polish translation program of Polski Instytut Książki. So much for the bold facts. So now there is a section where I analyze why it is a mistake and an error to call this book a diary, because there is no explication in Spanish of diary that would include works from the past, neither in the dictionaries, neither in Spanish poetics. So I studied a dictionary by Real Academia Española, or also some other dictionaries and Spanish poetics texts, which is not perhaps so important right now, but if you want, I can return to it in the discussion. I want to talk right now about how this book is composed, okay? So the book was published with two accompanying paratexts, the translator's nota preliminar, where her name is misspelled, and an epilogue by Leszek Smoliński from 1988. His name is also misspelled as Leszek Smoliński. Olszewska Sonnenberg begins with situating the Warsaw Uprising on the map of World War II events, especially as seen from the Polish perspective. September of '39, German invasion, Russian invasion, the Katyn genocide, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This gesture seems to belong to the qualities of memoirs in the light of the definitions of Spanish poetics. This is, however, the knowledge that Białoszewski assumed to be widely known on behalf of his Polish readers, because everyone must understand that this book was not written with the purpose of being translated in his mind. He wrote it for his Polish readers, and he also thought that he would have to fight, and he did have to fight for the publication of this book in Polish. So he never thought in the first place, nor in the second place, about translations. Because if he thought, had he thought that, he would have changed completely, probably, the qualities that we also discussed right now today in this discussion. In the next move, the translator gives the numbers, that is, she uses the discourse of traditional history, the history of great events, in numbers. We know these numbers. However, Olszewska Sonnenberg uses this fact to explain the character of Białoszewski's work and its genre, that is to say, to explain her decision why this narrative could be called a diary. Białoszewski era autor de este libro es uno de esos supervivientes. Como muchos otros testigos de la destrucción de su ciudad, decide de dejar memoria de su experiencia. Diario del levantamiento de Varsovia, el resultado de su peculiar reconstrucción de los hechos, tiene poco que ver con otros libros de memorias de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, which I roughly translate to English as: Białoszewski, the author of this book, is one of the survivors. And like many other witnesses of his city's destruction, he decided to leave a memory of his experience. Diary of the Warsaw Uprising is a result of his peculiar reconstruction of the events, and it has little in common with other memories from the World War II. So, the translator seems to be saying that because Białoszewski does not include the great history discourse, the panorama, but the witness's perspective, and because so many books on World War II, which represent the genre of memories or memoirs, employed that discourse and panorama view, they are the true memorias, while this one is totally different, and that explains why she chose Diario. Although she mentions justly that this is a reconstruction of events. We are supposed to understand the events from his witness perspective, not the great history events. Why would this reconstruction be peculiar, however? The translator gives a few reasons. We might conclude from the paragraph's logic that the first reason is because ordinary reconstructions make use of great history and panorama. She reinforces this aspect in one of the following paragraphs. So she speaks here about the humbleness of his point of view. I will omit it. Another reason for using the word peculiar is the style of the account. Here, the translator describes this style as if forestalling the accusation that she did her translation wrong. This accusation is probably every Białoszewski's translator's concern that needs forestalling, and probably on as early stages as the conversations with the publisher and their editors. We talked about it in Paris and with Eric Vaux and with Luca Bernardini. That you have to fight with the publisher because they think that this is a bad translation, that this kind of language. If you deliver the translation into spoken language. However, also the characteristics of the style, as she gives them, suit the description of the language in diaries in Spanish poetics. Because those definitions in Spanish poetics said that diaries have no embellishments, they are spoken lively, and they use a colloquial language, which is both spontaneous and immediate, regardless of grammar norms. Especially these two last qualities, spontaneity and immediacy, are similar to dictionary descriptions of Diario. So here we have it. This certainly can be applied to Białoszewski's book. However, the translator remarks, and she has to do that in order to ensure accuracy, that this style of writing applies to recollection, recuerdo. Spontaneity and immediacy of a recollection are actually either imprecise, either a contradiction. Certainly, we who know Białoszewski understand her point. She means not that Białoszewski experienced sudden jumps and ejaculations of recollections and wrote them down as fast as he could. We understand that he tried to recreate this impression of here and now, of a spontaneous narration, perhaps to conceal even the fact to which he pleaded guilty, that he talked and talked this topic over and over before. In another paragraph, Sonnenberg mentions that the book was written, and it jumped, was written more than 2 decades after the Uprising, and this, she claims, makes it different from the other works. This is incorrect, obviously. I think that what she means is that this book is not as immediate as Tadeusz Borowski, Zofia Naukowska, or even some stories by Jerzy Andrzejewski. But an uninformed reader wouldn't understand that probably that way. Nonetheless, Spanish readers who are facing this book for the first time, and not for the 14th time, like me, for instance, do they really understand all these implications and nuances that she discusses, that I discuss here? I comment what she says. And finally, does this Spanish reader understand the choice of diary? I think what the translator's note lacks is a phrase that Białoszewski wrote his memoir as if it was a diary. This quality did not go unnoticed by the Polish literary critics, for instance, Kazimierz Wyka. This as if it was represents time difference emphasized in all the discussions of how diaries differ from memoirs in Spanish poetics. Now, the second text, that's an interesting story. I consulted Adam also on this occasion, who consulted Mr. Prümer, because it's a text actually unknown to Polish readers. Let's find out. As for the second paratext, Leszek Soliński's epilogue is a bit of a mystery. This text has been practically unknown to Polish scholars of Białoszewski. Apparently, the story behind it, and if I get it wrong, we will straighten it up soon. So the story behind it is that Soliński wrote it in 1988 for the German translation of Memoir, that you mentioned, Dagmara, which was published in 1994 with this text. It was published also in Polish in an ephemeral theater program, which is not available in any library. Even though we have this kind of egzemplarz obowiązkowy thing, which means that there are some libraries that have to get everything that was published. Theater programs do not include that. So this text is actually unavailable in Polish. 6 years after Soliński's death, his husband and copyright inheritor, Henk Prümer, offered that it be included also in the Spanish translation. Had this text been published in Polish in 1988, or even in 1994, or even in 2011, it would have been a sensation, because it unveils a few unknown facts. Even if today, since 2020, we know some of the facts given previously to international readers, there are still some new pieces of information here. This text begins with the presentation of Soliński himself in a way that clearly suggests a gay relationship. Namely, he says that they lived 25 years together and were friends for 33 years. They lived together in the same apartment, etc. This, in a way, justifies why he's the right person to write this epilogue, but also explains, in a way, the form of the essay, which combines elements of biography, commentary, recollections, or even gossip. After giving a biographical introduction with a special focus on World War II times, Soliński mentions 3,000 books on Warsaw Uprising written until now, that is, I assume, up to 88, among which Białoszewski's book is unique. I suppose this is the source that Olszewska-Sonnenberg used in her introduction. Then, Soliński, in a paragraph, mentions the negative criticism that the book received. And this paragraph seems a bit mythicized. It speaks of criticism in plural, and only negative ones, while, as we know from the history of reception of Memoir, there was in fact one really negative review, and over 2,000 of positives, to enthusiastic. All the accusations that Soliński attributes to criticism in plural come actually from one review by Wojciech Żukrowski, which was studied extensively by me and Adam Poprawa. I think the author wanted to create a somewhat dramatic or sensational effect, and also to create a sharp contrast between the critics who misunderstood this work and the reading public who loved the book from the start. This is also mythicized a bit. Not only most of the reviews were positive, as I have just mentioned, but also the book was not so popular among readers in Poland, excluding school kids who had to. Nor did people spoke of it as a good read. It was rather the more professional readers who overtly expressed how the book was and is important. Perhaps this paragraph is of little importance to Spanish readers. However, it could have been more significant to German readers back then. In the subsequent paragraphs, Soliński gives the details that remained unknown in Poland, at least to wider audiences, and scholars included, and some of them sound fresh even today. Namely, he says how Białoszewski was writing his book for 20 years and destroying early versions of it. We knew it. However, Soliński gives a title of one of the early versions that the writer burned in 1950, 5 years under occupation, with two main characters, Stefa and Marcelek. Marcelek, I understand that's a transformation of Miron, and Stefa we all know. And it was written in the style of Bruno Schulz. This we didn't know. Next, Soliński tells how Miron took him on a trip through the ruins of Warsaw in 1950, telling the story of the Uprising, and there they met Frania, Miron's grandmother, who lived among the ruins. This we didn't know. Another novelty is the story of a trigger that made Białoszewski write the final version of Memoir. This trigger was a public reading of war stories by a peer writer, which both Miron and Leszek considered very bad, full of pathos and affected language. So they left the meeting stealthily, and Białoszewski allegedly made a vow that his version will be very different. Soliński does not give the name of the incriminated author, yet it is easy to guess that he meant Sven. He had to omit the name because Sven is a character, one of the main characters in the book, although international public didn't know that Sven was also a published writer after war in Poland. I am not in the position to say that this story is not true. However, some things seem to be mythicized in the light of the facts. We must be in the mid-60s. Białoszewski was in a conflict with Sven back then. They did not talk anymore, which makes it little probable that he went to Sven's reading, although not impossible. Perhaps they, that means he and Leszek, not only came out stealthily, but were there stealthily all the time. What Sven must have been reading were the war stories that he included in his book of prose, Pejzaż Gnojnej Góry, published in 1968. All the stories were written in the early 50s in Kobyłka, however, where Miron spent a lot of time, and the two then friends would write their works and read them aloud. I am positive that Białoszewski knew Kość Grzebu Gorejącego from 1954, which there's an epigraph that it was written that year at in Kobyłka, and this is the last story in Pejzaż Gnojnej Góry. So Miron must have known it from the moment it was written. Moreover, I believe that some of his early versions of Memoir were written there, in Kobyłka, at the same time, and possibly the same style, actually, as if on a literary competition. And the two writers read them aloud and discussed. And last but not least, that Białoszewski's early version was quite similar in style to Sven's. If anything, in mid-60s, Białoszewski was disgusted rather with the fact that Sven did not re-evaluate and abandon the poetics that they once shared. Then time passed and the very Białoszewski changed drastically, and Sven did not. Finally, in his epilogue, Soliński mentions the notebooks of Memoir and even quotes some phrases from them. Most of us, the scholars, actually learned about them around 2019, when Adam Poprawa started working on them and preparing them for publication. This is what I meant when I said that had this text been published in Polish earlier, it would have been a sensation. Still, the benefits for the Polish reader are one thing, and the significance of this paratext to Spanish readers is something different. Therefore, I have to ask now how important this was and is for Spanish readers. No doubt they would not notice those tiny nuances that I'm now tracking up. It is a good introduction to Białoszewski's biography and what he did during World War II, and versus the translator's introduction, this account is personal, so that these two accounts are complementary. The more traditional view on history and the personalized one. Although I must say I would have perhaps reversed these paratexts and would give Soliński first and the translator at the end. His account would insert the reader already in the perspective of the narrator, adding some details that Białoszewski in his book does not give. Hers, the translator's, Białoszewska-Sonnenberg, would complement the personal story with historical facts, adding a more general context. One thing for me is certain, because of the fact that Soliński discusses Białoszewski's talking over and over, writing over and over new versions and destroying them as time was passing, it all plays against the choice of Diario. It could work for the concept of a recreated diary or a mock diary, as an inner genre dipped in a memoir, yet it is not presented here as such. Thus I believe that Białoszewski's text with this paratext rather leave the Spanish reader confused. Why is this called a diary? So now I'm moving to the reception in Spain, and I found a few texts which I have also in PDFs. I'll be showing them. So how the book was received in Spain. Jocularly speaking, among Spanish readers, the translation was the biggest hit among my Erasmus students of Polish gay literature and social change course at Jagiellonian University. I estimate that even 30 up to 50 students chose this book for an exam. Some of them also bought it, so I contributed to the success. When the translation was published, only one professional review was published in the traditional media, which is Francisco Luis del Pino Olmedo's double review of Białoszewski and Jan Karski under the title La Tragedia Polaka. Ironically, so to speak, it was published on April 19th, 2011, which was the day of the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. As the title already suggests, the author's discourse is focused on la tragedia y el valor de Polonia durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, that is on the tragedy and courage of Poland. This starting point is certainly more favorable, so to speak, to Karski, and it is also more Polish, actually, and less Białoszewski. Karski's book in this review, Karski's book was published the same year, eclipsed, in a way, Białoszewski, because it received circa 10 professional reviews in the newspapers, including one by a famous Spanish philosopher, Jorge Semprún, and also some 8 more articles on Karski. Also in this review, Karski's book eclipsed Białoszewski because the actual review is of Karski exclusively. I will show you how it looks, because this is sort of significant. So it was published in Keller, which was a special literary supplement. So you can see the title, La Tragedia Polaka, and you see that 2 books are actually mentioned as... Oh, I didn't know that. I don't know how to do it. I thought that you were seeing my text all the time. I'm sorry. What's the button? There's a button. Agnieszka, do you know the button to press? Does anyone know the button? Is it F11?
F5.
F5? Where is F5? F5?
First row.
Yes, but this one? No, I'm sorry. Okay, so you have to trust me. Jest PDF. So you have to, okay, so like the title suggests that it's a review of Jan Karski and of Miron Białoszewski. But as a matter of fact, the whole review is only of Jan Karski, and there is just an additional note in the end on Białoszewski as inserted inside. It's like a small note inside. Okay, so I'm sorry, I have the PDFs, but you won't be able to see them, so you have to trust me. So it looks like this. So it's a short 5 sentence. Okay. 5 sentence short note on Białoszewski actually. So Pino Olmedo starts with a great history discourse adorned with the martyrological flavors on Poland under World War II, that the country suffered a lot, so many people were killed, but the Polish people never gave up. From there, I'm sorry I'm saying this in this manner, but I'm trying to make it more ridiculous because we already. From here, he moves to the account of Jan Karski, but he also mentions Józef Czapski's book. As for the note on Białoszewski, it starts with Soliński's information about 3,000 books on the Uprising, and this one being the most original of them. Then, the reviewer accepts the genre of diary as written after a long time, so he accepts it. Su diario, escrito 20 años después del levantamiento, narra la transhumancia familiar y ciudadana entre escombros y sótanos, which roughly means his diary, written 20 years after the uprising, narrates the familial and civic nomadism between ruins and basements. He then calls the narration excellent and a terrifying literary piece of tenderness for the ones around the author. Asombrosa pieza literaria de ternura por la gente que vivió el levantamiento junto al autor. So curiously enough, the reviewer noticed the poetic dimension of Białoszewski's style, calling it lyrical in its dryness, profound in its apparent narrative vulgarity. Lírico en su sequedad, profundo en su aparente vulgaridad narrativa. Even in such an epitomic form, this is a very favorable review and very on point. Paradoxically, this short note on Białoszewski is closer to a proper literary review, while the longer text is more a presentation of Karski's history or biography, not an evaluation of the book as such. So that was the only professional reading at that time. But perhaps due to the fact that Poland was becoming a more and more popular tourist destination for Spanish citizens, and also, I am not joking, because Poland was a very popular Erasmus destination, and one of the places in Poland that were extremely popular was the Warsaw Uprising Museum in Warsaw. Białoszewski's book enjoyed a kind of a second life, so to speak. This time it was professional critics as well as the so-called non-professional readers on blogs, on comments under bookshops, online, etc., etc. So the first of them was published in 2015 by a Spanish writer, José Fernández Peiró, who, this is very interesting actually, is a historian by education. He finished history in the Universidad de Valencia, and also he published he published a novel, his first novel. As a matter of fact, it speaks of Second World War in Poland, and Irena Sendlerowa in particular. It's called El Círculo de las Bondades. It was not translated to Polish. So he knew the context, okay? Fernández Peiró was well equipped to understand Białoszewski. I'm not sure if he read Białoszewski as part of his research on World War II in Warsaw before finishing his novel, or was this reading a consequence of his specializations? And this is significant because if he used Białoszewski in his novel, which I don't know because I don't have access to the novel yet, but I'm going to read it, so we'll see about Sendlerowa. So if he uses Białoszewski somehow, that would be very enriching for my essay and for the international reception of Białoszewski as such, okay? I am aware that, so in his review, Fernández Peiró uses the word memorias interchangeably with Diario, which he attributes to the necessary work of traumatic memory. So he, even though the book was translated as Diario, he knows that this is Memoirs, okay? So probably he concluded that after reading Leszek Somiński's epilogue and drew correct conclusions. As for the diaristic side, he sees it in the day-by-day narrative of the insurrection events, which is not entirely true in Białoszewski. It exists as a subsidiary discourse, but the narrative is not organized around it. I think this is historian thinking, you know, because he suggests that actually Białoszewski made a remark like, this day this was bombarded, etc., which is obviously not true. And this is not the dominant plot in the diary. Now for the style, because here something interesting appears for the first time. Interesting and problematic. When the writer summarizes Białoszewski's style, he says, Białoszewski relata los sucesos con un lenguaje llano, plenamente comprensible para todo el mundo, y con bastante frialdad, which roughly means Białoszewski narrates the events with a simple / plain / direct / straightforward / flat language, completely understandable for everyone and quite cold. Any of the English adjectives we take as an equivalent to Spanish llano, and I could not pick one, we, the Polish readers, think that the reviewer is incorrect. That obviously leads to the question of the quality of the Spanish translation, which I will examine in the last section of this essay. Certainly in Polish it was the language not understandable for everyone easily that shocked some readers, and I doubt that many Polish readers would call Pamiętnik an easy read. Would anyone here? Let's talk about it later. As far as I remember my exams with Spanish Erasmus students, they were saying something like, at the beginning the language is strange, but you have to get used to it, and then it flows. They said the same of Las Puertas al Paraíso by Jerzy Andrzejewski, Bramy Raju. I think the writer might have slipped up in the illusion of common awareness or false consensus effect in social psychology, that he projected his own greater competence of a writer, avid reader, and a historian on less competent readers. Ferrandis Peiro makes a very well-informed comment on the political situation of the Nazi destruction of Warsaw and the Russian troops awaiting the destruction. Okay, so I'll move to briefly to conclude the second wave of professional criticism. I will mention briefly my own texts in a popular Spanish cultural magazine online, The Citizen S, which was a presentation of Anna Świerszczyńska's poems about the Warsaw Uprising in my translation to Spanish and with my commentaries. There, I mentioned Białoszewski and his memoir 15 times, starting with the problematic translation of Diario, and then showing similarities between the image of barricades in both writers, the civil voice, the help given to insurrectionists by the citizens, the solidarity between people, sexual relationships during the uprising, and last but not least, the similarity of time lapse between the events and the publication of their respective literary works. So now we have the non-professional reception, and we have a fun entry by someone called Alberto Bo, published in May 2018 on the blog dedicated to Polish forces during World War II, because there is a blog in Spanish dedicated entirely to Polish military in Spanish, which is very surprising. Well, I was unable to ascertain if Alberto Bo is a real name, and if the person is from a Spanish-speaking country. They write in Spanish and quote Polish books in Spanish translations. The blog has quite a military bias, which, when we remember historical examples from Poland, does not always suit Białoszewski greatly. Nonetheless, the author mentions some other books, including Józef Czapski and Helena Janeczek, who is our guest tomorrow, and he also gives a short portrait of Krzysztof Baczyński. All the entries on literature are observably shorter than the ones on soldiers, equipment, and military actions. Therefore, Alberto Bo had to make a reserve. En el libro no se describen combates ni acciones heroicas, pero muestra la dureza de día al día, which is, in this book, battles are not described, nor heroic actions, but it shows the hard times day after day. Then this reviewer makes a strange remark which explains the book's value. And this is because, I will not read it in Spanish, but I will say what they mean, what Alberto Bu means. Basically, the greatest value of Białoszewski's book is that he had a very good memory and eye, and he saw many buildings that were later destroyed. And those buildings are so important, you know, not anything else, nothing that we discuss here. The buildings were so important. Okay. So basically, there's one more entry, like a comment under a bookshop by someone called Dafatota, and they gave the book 8 stars out of 10, which is a lot. And this post was liked 4 times. So here again we read that this book is very easy to read, not very complicated in its style. There are also some other mistakes when the reviewer says that Białoszewski was a militant, and some other places that I have to bypass. But so now it all leads to the question: is this translation any good? I will abstain from giving a judgment. I will just say that after I studied it, it actually might give the impression that it is easier to read it in Spanish than it is to read it in Polish. Why? For instance, the first thing that we notice when we even open the book is that the translator created paragraphs where there are, in Białoszewski there were none, okay? It was like flowing, and she created paragraphs. I will show you also some examples how she simplified the language. So we have this phrase in Polish. 25 września, no, to był ten dzień decydujący, od rana do nocy, 12 godzin, bombardowanie całej Warszawy. Here, she changes 3 small details. So she omits this no, she changes bombardowanie całej Warszawy, the noun, she gives a verb, and she changes the graphics of this phrase, because it is written with marks, and she just makes it a basic sentence. But one of the worst examples, actually, is where she completely misunderstands, is this famous phrase about the Polish people as Aryans during the Easter of 1943. I will say it in Polish. Aryjczycy, tak zwani jeszcze wtedy my, po kościołach, odświętni, a tam, to piekło, to wiadome, tylko bez nadziei. So, in Spanish, this phrase sounds like this. Los arios seguíamos llamándonos así, estábamos en las iglesias de celebración, mientras que allí, en aquel infierno, lo sabíamos, no había esperanza. Instead of analyzing the changes, I will just retranslate the Spanish phrase into Polish, word by word, okay? Aryjczycy, tak siebie wciąż jeszcze nazywaliśmy, byliśmy w kościołach świętując, podczas gdy tam, w tym piekle, wiedzieliśmy już, nie było nadziei. It's completely different. And this is not the only example like that, but this one is very significant because for obvious reasons. There are some fragments which I retranslated from Spanish, and they make no sense. Even if we understand that Białoszewski's style is not easy to grasp in the first moment in Polish, after a second you analyze it and you understand that this is very precise and you get the meaning. You can get used to this language. In Spanish you read it and you don't know what she means. Okay? So, but I wouldn't like my conclusion to be that negative. Anyway, so maybe it's not the worst thing that it's an easy read for Spanish readers because they read it, okay? So if that's a positive conclusion, thank you very much, and let's have a discussion right now.
Yes, we have 10 minutes for questions.
Do you know what you talked about your reception in Spain, but do you know anything about the reception in Latin America? Because the publishing house got the rights for the whole world.
Mm-hmm. And, I only know what the internet showed, and everything was Spain related. I don't think this is. I don't think that this is a problem with this search because I put a filter search in Spanish, and everything that I saw and I quoted came from Spain. I was actually surprised that there were so many. I thought that there was no reception at all. I mean, this is not the reception that we dream of, but there is some. I was surprised. I thought there would be none, but in Latin America, no. This could be, and this is a topic I am not on the solid ground, but there is a problem if you publish something in Spain, and in theory it is available in Latin American countries, but I think, for instance, Gombrowicz is published by two publishing houses, Seix Barral in Spain and Sudamericana for South American countries. I don't know, maybe this is the problem, that if something is published in Spain, this does not receive that much attention in Latin America. I'm not sure about this.
Yes, but in the case of Gombrowicz, where there's two different translations, or just one translation published?
Two different translations, yes.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Two different translations,
Mm-hmm.
okay. Well, that's a different matter.
Yes.
There would be no right to translate the book into Spanish in Latin America,
Mm-hmm.
because the Alba Publishing House got the rights for the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So they would have to do something to get the book distributed in Latin America, which obviously they didn't. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, of course.
Exactly, that's the thing. I think they published it in Spain and thought that if anything sells and promotes itself in Latin America, okay, we are happy, but we don't invest in it, okay? I think they invested only in their main market in Spain, if they invested anything.
Well, they could have had contact with these publishing houses in Latin America, which would have distributed the book, but
Yes.
they probably didn't.
They probably didn't. Thank you very much.
I must say I like this idea, this controversial idea, problematic, that his device to call memoir a diary.
Mm-hmm.
His arguments are just simple, like, spontaneity, present time, immediacy, day-by-day narration. And if we take any statesman of the theory of literature, either Głowinski or Lejeune, it fits. Simply, Miron Białoszewski fits to the theory of a diary. And his perfect memory, it was natural. He could has memory to recapitulate all the dialogues within his dreams. And it's for Michał Głowinski, it's an argument for it could not be in a diary. In Miron Białoszewski, everything is possible. So I like this idea, and I used to read him like a diary, simply. And I remember such an idea, maybe I am wrong, of a lyrical diarist of his, this is interesting. But the conclusion is that Miron Białoszewski doesn't fit to any group of writers. He's unique, and that is why we are here, and we have so many problems. He cannot be within either Polish, like Gombrowicz, like Leśniak, or in any, he doesn't fit any group, either in Polish literature or in European or American literature. And he is really osobny in a sense.
No, but I was
global and universal, and at the same time.
But I was only thinking that some of my students were actually confused, because if they didn't study the book to great extent, which they should do for an exam, right? they were saying that it was written during the wartime because it's a diary. So this could be misleading. That's why, because what you're saying, I agree completely. And I said, this is like a diary recreated inside the memoir. And this is a precise word of saying it. And just one phrase by the translator and everything would be perfect, okay? If you want to call it a diary, great. But explain it in the comment. So that people don't think that this is a direct source, like written during the Uprising or just 1 year later after the war, because this is something that actually he mentions. Białoszewski mentions, obviously we know it in famous paragraphs, that it's written and recorded 25 years later, etc., etc. But if you a student who reads quickly, let's say, or you're not a student, but you're reading it quickly because, I don't know, because it's an easy read. So you swallow it, and then you don't remember, and you might have the wrong impression that this is the same thing as this diary by this Jewish boy, I forgot the name in Świętokrzyskie, you know which one, that ends very abruptly, and we know why, etc. This kind of testimony literature, this is misleading. This is a recreation, and it's good for this reason that this is a recreation. It should be appreciated as such, that this is a recreation of a diary, not because it was written the next day, but because it was written 25 years later, and it still can look like a diary, and it's not false. So, yeah, okay, sorry.
Miron faked the diary.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what.
Not only probably a diary, but a journal intime. It sounds much more like a journal intime, but the way I will speak about it tomorrow, in Italy it has been described as a reportage. And that's quite interesting as well. I mean, the fact that it could have been written on the spot by a journalist and not as a poet or I mean somebody who is reminding all this. Now, I would like just to add a small anecdote about this military side of things. That it's very much appreciated, unfortunately. And when we had this presentation in Florence in early March, and the war has begun in Ukraine, I had this proposal by a small company of reactors that they react the second Polish corps in Italy, Anders Corps, and the Polish insurgents to come to the presentation of the book dressed in uniforms and sporting stands and rifles. And I had to say no, thank you. I mean, it's a war there outside, and I don't think that nobody would really understand what the point is. But these very quite young people, they are students, university students with very strong interest in history and so on. They have read the pamiętnik as a sort of, writing about the Polish uprising, and they defy themselves with the military side of things instead with poetry.
From the point of view of trauma writing, for instance, if we don't accept the fact that there's a time lapse, but we see it as a reportage or as a diary, this is a very different understanding of trauma in the text, if this is important for us. But there are scholars who write about trauma, including Joanna Nijińska and I recently, that trauma we read as a process, as a product of memory in time. But if you say that this is a diary or a reportage probably can only document trauma, but not be a psychological expression of it, I suppose, in theory. And diary could be this expression, but in a very different way. So you read trauma, and this is a very different reading of trauma. If you think that this is a diary, just like we do with Anne Frank's journal, or this journal by this Jewish boy, from Świętokrzyskie, voivodeship, and this is a very different reading when you read the memoir, and we search for traces of ellipsed fragments or unspoken things that were traumatic enough to not to be mentioned in full voice, etc., etc. But yeah, thank you. Sorry. One thing I could mention also that I didn't read is I have a suspicion, I have a suspicion about this military blog by Alberto Bo, because as I was studying this blog, I noticed something strange, some kind of saying thank you and crediting a Polish Institute in Madrid for some photographs and some documents about the Polish military in World War II. So I was thinking, is this Alberto Bo a real person, or perhaps this is a persona invented by some Polish diplomats, cultural diplomats, like, spreading the propaganda actually about the Polish military actions. This entry is from 2018, not, you know what it means, 3 years after political change. Perhaps this is kind of propaganda, actually, where Białoszewski does not fit, but he was translated, so they incorporated him into that. Just a suggestion, I don't know.
So thank you.
Lunch.
We are very hungry now.
Yes, let's have a lunch. There's lunch, and we meet at 3?
3 p.m.
3 p.m., okay.
How are you? Good, English? Good. So
English,
no French.
English. No French.
How are you?
English and Spanish. Yeah.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I just finished my classes for today.
Oh, great.
I see you've been to Greece.
Yes.
Yes, we did.